That's violence. That's so when we say America, China, Russia are the most powerful people, no, they're not powerful. They're just the ones with the greatest capacity to cause destruction if people don't do what they want. That's not power. What psychosis makes us make sure that force, coercion, and destruction is the equivalent of power. But we live in a world where power is now confused with force and craziness. So people are like, I want to be the most powerful. No, you want to be the person who can force the most people to do what you want to do, right? But in the paradigm I'm describing, where power is exactly that idea of how much life can I create and sustain, that's when we see that feminine energy is more powerful at certain points. And the challenge here now is that these ways of thinking are not purely for the West, right? Because when I talk about whiteness or blackness, it's no longer something that's locked in a white body or a black body. Change those. And again, if your main idea of what it means to be human is about survival of the fittest, then your economics becomes about survival of the fittest. Your religion becomes about survival of the fittest, right? Who's going to heaven, who's going to hell? Right? Your family life becomes about survival of the fittest, right? Who's the alpha, who's in charge, who's running things in the home. Your friendships become about the survival of the fittest. And funny enough, they will use nature to justify this thing. They will say, but look, in nature, the strongest one always wins and so forth. And then you try to explain a simple thing, like you said, you don't see a lion going out to practice killing on a weekend because it knows it'll have to kill, 2 weeks from now when it's hungry again. But they'll say, no, but it's in charge with the... So even the basic, what you're giving is an example of basic indigenous wisdom of any culture that's still close or had a close understanding of nature, right? And is knowledgeable about it. That knowledge no longer counts, even though it's still very real. To them, it doesn't count. How do you say to somebody who lives based on a nightmare that somebody is coming to kill them? How do you negotiate anything logical with them in that case, when the entire life is built around that, right? And much of Western culture is built around that. Even the fundamentals of economics, right? People have critiqued this and they get laughed at. People have said, what is the fundamental of economic that we're taught? And this is just an example of flawed logic that we accept as reality all over the world, right? The idea of supply and demand as the basis of economics, right? The problem with that is what? What happens when supply is met? There's no longer a demand, right? The economy crumbles. What happens when the demand is met? The supplier will die because there's no longer, that. So we can see the functioning of contemporary economics based on that flawed foundation of economics, because now people have to generate demand when there is no demand in order to keep the supply going. And then we complain about capitalism. Why is there a new phone every year? Yes, because we need to generate that demand now. Because everyone already has their phone. Now we need to make sure they still want another phone to keep economics alive. Right? So we now have to keep making phones. And in order to keep making phones, now we have to go to the Congo and make children work in mines just to have a new phone. And also to keep people wanting phones, we need to have what's called planned obsolescence. Every phone we make should not last 2 years now. Every car we make has to die within X number of years now.
To produce more.
Exactly. We see in Cuba, the cars made in the 30s and 40s, they're still working, right? But that's before this new economics, when that economic model failed. Now we need to make sure people keep wanting and keep needing. So that's a flawed foundation of economics. It's not based on necessity or actual progress, just a paranoid desire to continue to make, a frenzy of maintaining desire and demand and that cycle, right? So that's one example of flawed logic, just by definition. That should not be economics. There are more sustainable models of economics. right? And if we think of simple, another one that I like to throw out is the definition of power. What is power? I ask people what is power. People always say, yes, the capacity to achieve what you want to achieve, to get people to do what you want them to do, to make things happen the way you want them to happen. And I say, no, that's not power. That's the exact definition of force or coercion, right? Indeed. That's violence. That's so when we say America, China, Russia are the most powerful people, no, they're not powerful. They're just the ones with the greatest capacity to cause destruction if people don't do what they want. That's not power. What psychosis makes us make sure that force, coercion, and destruction is the equivalent of power? If we look at it from African and other indigenous perspectives, power is your capacity to create and to sustain life. That is why the divine, the creator, is the most powerful, right? The capacity to create and sustain life. That is power. But we live in a world where power is now confused with force and craziness. So people are like, I want to be the most powerful. No, you want to be the person who can force the most people to do what you want to do, right? But in the paradigm I'm describing, where power is exactly that idea of how much life can I create and sustain, that's when we see that feminine energy is more powerful, right? Because it creates more, whatnot, right? Societies that create and sustain life, that is powerful. The other ones, and it confuses me every time in the news, people say the most powerful, and it's just based on how much damage they can do to something. And we call that power. Linguistically, it's so there are many little insanities that are now woven into how we experience the world through this lens of a fearful historical whiteness that just need to be questioned and revisioned.
If they are ready to discuss, if they are ready to talk.
Yes. And at some point, I think we have to appreciate that we cannot do it with them, whoever them is in this situation. It just has to be done, because without us, they will continue on their path of destruction and so forth. So there's certain things we just have to do. And we will continue to invite people onto this thing, but we must accept that there are people who cannot be convinced at certain points. And the challenge here now is that these ways of thinking are not purely for the West, right? Because when I talk about whiteness or blackness, it's no longer something that's locked in a white body or a black body, right? There's whiteness, oppressive whiteness that lives within bodies of color, right? And the way to see this is technologies of oppression are not very inventive. The same technologies of oppression that were used by colonizers are at times being used by post-colonial African governments, right? The technologies of oppression that were being used in slavery are at times being used in Latin American countries by Latinx presidents and governments. They use the same technologies of whiteness, which means whiteness happens in there and in how we act, which is another reason why pointing at something that's black from the outside doesn't make a difference, or white on the outside doesn't make a difference. Because when humans interact, it is impossible for us not to affect each other and to change each other.
So true.
So at this point, many people are living these split lives where they want certain things, but those